The Bombardier Alstrom HP8, which I have not determined an effective way to abbreviate, so I'm just going to say the P8 just for clarity, but we all know what we're talking about. This is an electric locomotive that was manufactured by, well, a consortium of Bombardier Transportation and Alstrom for Amtrak and MARC. MARC, by the way, stands for Maryland Rail Commuter. It is a smaller regional railway within the United States, much like Amtrak is a large-scale railway, the national railway system in the United States. Now, a major part of Amtrak's system is the Northeast Corridor, which is a 457-mile or 735-kilometer line between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts, which also passes through New York City. It is their crowning point. It is easily their busiest line of rail in the entire country. And in the 90s, they spent significant time and effort to electrify the lines. However, they didn't actually have the rolling stock necessary to utilize electric locomotives on the lines, which I would imagine would have been a thing they would have thought of well before they did that. But anyway, the point was they wanted to stop using diesel locomotives on the Northeast Corridor. They wanted to use electric, which is fine. So they contacted Bombardier and Alstrom, who have made excellent locomotives in the past, to create a new locomotive for them. The result was the HHP8. And it was not great. It was just not at all. Now, when they were working well, they really were pretty decent. They were very fast, they were efficient, they were fine, when they were working, but like with anything that I talk about in this list, that really is the, tipping point there, when it's working. The P8s only served Amtrak for a decade due to their horrific reliability issues. In fact, 15 units were withdrawn from service in 2002 because there were cracked components in their trucks, which is horrifying, actually. Amtrak just couldn't deal with constantly having to fix them, and they weighed the option of refurbishing them, but opted to replace them entirely instead, mostly with the Siemens ACS-64, which turned out a lot better. As for MARC, they actually refurbished their P8s and are still using them. After going through that multi-year process, they have turned out to be a lot better after the necessary fixes were made. So I guess you could say if you see one now, it's probably fine. But when they were introduced, no, not at all. It's the opposite of that. The United States Army Transportation Corps S-160 class. This is a weird one because this was actually a pretty prevalent locomotive manufactured, and it got dispatched to a lot of different countries, and in some instances, they were actually perfectly fine. So I am referring to a very specific set of these that was introduced to the UK by us, and you're welcome, by the way. I don't think anyone's going to thank me after this, but we'll get to that. As far as the details go, the S-160s were two 8-2 consolidation steam locomotives. Consolidation refers to that wheel arrangement, 280. Every single locomotive that had that wheel arrangement generally was called a consolidation. And overall, the consolidations were pretty decent locomotives despite not having trailing wheels. They had significant tractive effort and did what they did pretty well. But the S-160s are a weird case because you may recognize that these particular locomotives were manufactured by the United States Army Transportation Corps, USATC. The USATC funded the design and creation of these locomotives specifically for the need for more rolling stock during World War II. They were all manufactured between 1942 and 1945, and the S-160s were designed for speedy manufacturing, not actual working longevity. Now, they could do their job pretty well for a short amount of time, maybe a few years tops. But they weren't designed for longevity. Like, these were very much throwaway engines. And in that context, it's hard to call them bad because, yeah, okay, I get why they would have been manufactured in that way. Obviously, the intent was to just get these things out so, other countries could use them because that was the other thing they were for. They were sent to a whole slew of nations, Africa, Asia, all of Europe, and South Africa. They were all over the place. And one of the places that actually took them was the UK. The UK had plenty of steam engines on their own, obviously, but they could have used more because, again, World War II, they were busy. They had to. As we discussed in previous videos, many of the engines they were still using, actually, they were supposed to be retired, and they had to put them back into service because they just needed more rolling stock to move stuff around. So we, being the generous Americans that we are, decided to send you guys a bunch of S160s, and I am so sorry. I know I said you're welcome earlier, but yeah, because we managed to do some friendly fire with these things. Here was the problem. Regarding the specific UK version of the S160s, due to the compromises when it came to designing them for quick assembly and not longevity, the axle box grease lubricators were not very efficient, and usually when maintenance procedures lapsed or were delayed in a war situation, like they were, I don't know why we didn't think about that, the axle boxes ran really, really hot. Braking was rather poor by modern standards because they used a Westinghouse steam brake, which was not sufficient for this type of locomotive at all. But the major fault, the biggest problem, was the use of a single water gauge for this locomotive. The design of the water gauge and the fact that there was only one was unfamiliar to UK crews, and because of the gauge's design, it was necessary to open the top and bottom cocks slowly or the check valves would close. This traps the water in the gauge and gives a false reading. And as we've discussed before through other videos involving steam explosions, you may notice that not knowing how much water is in your steam locomotive is actually a very, very, very dangerous thing. So dangerous, in fact, that in the span of 10 months, 3 of the UK S160s suffered crown sheet failures, which killed at least 1 fireman. And I know historically I have made it a point to throw shade at British Rail, but this one's totally on us, guys. I'm gonna be real with you. They weren't even really built that well by our standards, and then you got them, and then the gauges were weird, and then they blew up, and we didn't mean to do that. And wow, this is awkward for me. I didn't make them. You can't yell at me. The British Rail Class 50. You know, I don't even know what I expect anymore. Other than this exact thing. You know, it's really normal. And honestly, after that last entry, I would feel really awkward getting mad now because, you know, you had a lot of bad diesels, guys, but I mean, so far their ineptitude didn't kill anybody, as far as I can remember. So, you know, well, I'm gonna give them a pass today. Because, to be fair, the Class 50 is not as bad as a lot of the other diesels I've talked about at British Rail. They were manufactured at about the same time. Diesel-electric locomotives, like always. Coco wheel layout. And they were okay, and lasted into the 90s, which is actually pretty impressive for a diesel manufactured between 1967 and 68. But they did suffer from serious reliability issues, like every single British Rail contracted diesel that was ever designed in the 60s, I swear. I know some of you have pointed out that there were a few that were good, and you're right, there were like 4. And also, that is a woeful comparison considering all the stuff they just threw out there. They just let anybody manufacture a diesel regardless of whether they were capable of it, and obviously they weren't. But the issue with the Class 50 is a little amusing to me, because overall, the actual design of the Class 50 is rather sound for any country that's not the United Kingdom. And what I mean by that is, when the reliability issues gained too much and they brought them in for refurbishment because British Rail did opt to actually fix the problems with these diesels rather than scrap them like a lot of the ones we've talked about, they discovered the biggest issue was the reason why they had their nickname. The engines were nicknamed Hoovers because they sounded like a vacuum cleaner. And no one ever bothered to really check why that was doing that, and they finally figured it out when they, took them in and tried to refurbish them. The problem was the air intake, which, again, was fundamentally totally fine for a non-humid environment. I don't know if this is news to anybody, but it totally rains in the United Kingdom. In fact, according to my sources, it actually rains quite a bit in the United Kingdom. It's actually a very normal thing there for it to rain. And the extra humidity in the UK that was not taken into account when it came to designing this particular locomotive meant that the particles in the air, the moisture, actually gummed up the works, causing what was at the time a state-of-the-art electronic system to fail just all the time. when they refurbished them, they actually didn't have this problem, but even after refurbishment, they had a weird issue of wheel slip, which is bizarre for a Coco. I'm not even sure how you do that. But like I said, the Class 50s did last a significantly longer amount of time than most of the diesels I've discussed before, especially when it comes to British Rail. They did fix them, and they did wind up being alright overall in the end, but that initial startup with the moisture thing was way too funny for me not to mention. I mean, come on. I've never read such a thing in my life. You guys didn't think about that it's wet out there? You guys live in the UK! The manufacturer was English Electric! Come on! Just saying. Just saying. And please don't throw the S-160s back in my face after this. I don't want to talk about those. The Cycloped. You know, I really had to weigh my options when it came to putting this one on the list because I was on the fence as to how much that counts as a locomotive at this point. I mean, it technically does have the conveyor that drives the wheels, so it's, you know, a little more than just a horse and cart, but ultimately it really is just a horse and buggy. Like, you might as well have the horse pull it, and that's kind of the Cycloped's problem. It was built by Thomas Shaw Brandreth of Liverpool. Yes, England, this was your idea. And at the time, people were experimenting with a whole bunch of different, you know, locomotive designs, and apparently Thomas thought that horsepower should be taken very literally, and that you should still use beasts of burden in a locomotive, which, I'm sorry, I thought the whole point of the invention of the steam engine was to avoid using the horse at all. And it really is a dirt simple design if you think about it. It really is just a treadmill that the horse moves on that moves the wheels forward. But it doesn't have a capacity that's any better than if you just had the horse pull it. It literally doesn't change anything. Thomas Brandreth was actually one of the directors of the railway at the time, and this was his idea, so he wanted it in the competition against a bunch of other designs, all of which used steam power, and all of which went faster than the Cycloped. Because of course they did. This idea was never gonna work out. This is the silliest thing I've seen. I mean, there were some weird designs when it came to early locomotives, I get that, but even for the era, this seems like a step backwards, don't you think? It's like the laziest idea possible, like, well, if we want to do direct drive wheels, let's just put the horse on the cart and make it drive it that way. No, Tom, that's not what we're talking about, and it didn't work. There were actually 2 other attempts to do it this way, both of which also did not work nearly as well as just using a steam engine like you should have done in the first place, but hey, it makes for a good talking point. Heck of a curiosity, I'll give it that. I'll give you that, Tom. You're welcome. The Hunman Horror. What the word I cannot say on this family-friendly show. There's so much wrong with this image, and it's one of those things that you look at, and the longer you look at it, the more it gets worse. The more questions that are raised. Okay, so this locomotive was built by the Hunman Locomotive Company in 1887 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And anyone who saw this thing actually had a knowledge of locomotive dynamics and designs and engineering immediately threw shade at this thing. So you may be looking at this and wonder, how does this work? What's the point of it? Okay, I'll tell you how it works in terms of drive. It is quite literally just a regular American steam locomotive. Except that the driving wheels, well, all the wheels, have been put on top of other wheels, which have been put on top of other wheels, and then those wheels are on the track. So they've just stacked wheels on wheels here. And you may be wondering why they did that. Well, the Hunman Company said that this is because they thought that this would make the locomotive run faster, which it will not. It will do not that at all. You'd be lucky if it went the same speed, let alone faster. And some of you might be defending this. Maybe this is an early attempt at a gearing system, because some of you defended the Fontaine that way and said maybe he was trying to make a gearing system. And geared locomotives do have a place when it comes to rail history. I haven't talked about them yet, and you're right, but that is so not what Hunman was going for here. And I will tell you why. Because evidence came out that the whole reason why the Hunman locomotive was created at all in this weird, insano way that you can't possibly look away from, is because they were trying to attract ignorant investors to a company that was effectively a front for a scam. Basically, this engine did function poorly, but it was never intended to function at all, really. It was meant to garner interest from people who didn't know any better, so they would give the Hunman Locomotive Company their money, so Hunman and his cohorts could then run away with said money, never to be seen again. How much money did they get away with using this scheme? It's unclear. We don't really know. But we do know they attempted to do it again 10 years later, so I guess they thought lightning struck twice. And incredibly, the second time around, they actually convinced Baldwin, of all people, to manufacture it. The second attempt. Yes, really, that Baldwin. Like, actually respected Baldwin that made a ton of great steam locomotives. They made the second bout of this monstrosity. Eventually, the engine was returned to Baldwin, who converted it into a regular American and then resold it because of course they did. And I'm still lost on the fact that not only did someone attempt this, but it actually kind of worked, apparently twice, because no one was ever brought to trial, no one was ever sued as far as anybody knows. They literally got in their investment money and then disappeared. Wow, I don't know whether to be offended or impressed by that, but as a result we have one of the worst designs I've ever seen for a steam locomotive. And I would argue, in fact, that if it weren't for the notion that this was made poor on purpose just to look weird, it might be the worst steam locomotive ever on the basis of sheer pointlessness. Because yeah, it didn't hurt anybody, it didn't explode or anything like that, but it literally doesn't do anything, and it wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of a way to scam people. And there's something about that that just rubs me the wrong way. But that's just my thoughts. Feel free to express your own down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.